Welcome to Transcendent. I'm Joe, and I'm the dad.
And I'm Raya, and I'm the daughter.
A few years ago, we had an exchange student that stayed with us from Germany. Wonderful girl. She and your sister got along really well. They were about the same age. They had a lot in common. She enjoyed being here in the U.S. She spoke English fluently. Her father, however, didn't speak English at all. So when she went back home, she told him that your sister was going to be coming back to visit. And he wrote us a letter. The letter said, I'm paraphrasing, thank you for having my daughter here. We're looking forward to your daughter coming to visit us, and I am happy to get revenge on you. Wrong choice of words.
A lot of times when you're in a community, it matters how you use the language, doesn't it?
Oh, it certainly does.
You and I have been in lots of work environments and other social environments where you have almost a sub-community that all speaks a certain language.
Well, there's jargon.
Jargon.
Yeah, there's a lot of jargon. When we still owned the publishing business, in the aviation division, they have their own jargon, and they have a lot of it. Everybody there knows the very common things, and even a lot of the non-aviation people know a lot of those words, like aileron. A lot of people know what that is, and a variety of other things. We were at a national trade show, and I had one of our employees there with me. He was going to be part of the aviation group, so he thought he would hang out and he would fit right in. Somebody came up and they had a little something in their pocket, which was what every pilot uses before they do their pre-flight, a gas check to make sure that you didn't have a lot of water in the tank. That's a critical thing. You do that when you have your very first aviation lesson. They teach you how to do the pre-flight. This employee was behind the booth, and the first guy that came up had one of those in his pocket, and he said, "What is that?" It's a pretty strong indication that this guy doesn't know anything about aviation.
It gave him away right away. This guy coming up to the table couldn't really trust him when it came to aviation topics if he couldn't get the very basic thing right. The language we use really matters when we're talking to communities that are highly invested. When we're talking about being an ally to the LGBTQ community, and really we should say communities, because there's a lot of variation even between the various letters, between gay and lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer, and all of the other ones that make up the plus, and even within each individual letter, you've got lots of diversity in there.
There's a lot of subsets.
There are some things in general that we want to get right when we talk about LGBTQ plus issues, and some things, as we were preparing for this episode, that even you and I have gotten wrong over time.
Absolutely.
We are just a father and daughter having conversations, talking about how do we get along, and we have both learned a lot, and we're still continuing to learn.
Yes, we certainly are. I'm learning now, as a matter of fact.
We wanted to start first by talking about some of the terminology, some of the specific things that you might find yourself saying that might be an outdated term that we don't use much anymore. The big one, of course, is to talk about homosexuals or homosexuality.
Yes, or just homo.
That is especially one that would be
objectionable.
Very objectionable.
Yes.
And of course, as we talk about different slurs and things, sometimes the language has gone the other way around. We've talked on this podcast before, and in fact, I used the word just now. Q now in the LGBTQ oftentimes stands for queer, although sometimes, as we talked about in our podcast about the Q, sometimes it can also mean questioning. Queer used to be a word that was very derogatory. And in fact, some people still feel hurt when they hear that word. But the LGBTQ community has reclaimed that word. I have no problem saying that I am a queer person, or somebody else that self-identifies as queer. That is a very common sort of thing now. We wouldn't want to preemptively identify somebody that has not chosen that word and say, oh, well, they're a queer person. Only if they have self-identified as being queer would we want to identify them as queer. That is a language piece that's really important. But when we talk about homosexuality or being a homosexual, that's just really outdated language. That can go away. Instead, we would want to call somebody gay. We would never say that's a gay, though. We would
Correct.
say that's a gay person. So gay is always going to be an adjective.
You mentioned that. I haven't actually heard that before, that somebody... Oh, yes, I have. Now that I think about it, I have, when they called someone gay.
Sometimes we'll talk about the gays will say this or that. And I can imagine some contexts where that might not be offensive, but it's going to depend a lot on who's saying it, when they're saying it, what the context is. If it is at a lesbian group and they say, well, the gays say this, that's going to have a different connotation than if you're hanging out at the bar with a mixed crowd and a straight man says, well, the gays think this. Entirely different.
Correct.
I would say in general, we steer clear from that kind of language. Now, lesbian, on the other hand, you can call somebody a lesbian. Again, you have to be careful with your words, but if you say, I have a friend, she's a lesbian, that is acceptable. Why is the one acceptable and the other one isn't? I don't know. That's just how we use language. But you can also then use it as an adjective.
Well, actually, that's what this podcast is about language and trying to educate ourselves and each other.
When we talk about bisexual or transgender, sometimes it's a surprise to people that it's generally considered respectful that you can shorten those. You can talk about bi, again, bi as an adjective. So you can talk about gay people and lesbians and bi people and trans people. That's okay. You would have no way of knowing that because I can very easily imagine a world where you would talk about trans people and that would be, oh, we don't say that. But by and large, that's considered a respectful term. As we get into then transgender, we talk about transgender as an adjective only. We don't talk about that person over there, they're a transgender. That feels very dehumanizing. In the same way that anything else would sound dehumanizing when you only use it as an adjective. For instance, it's acceptable to say, there's a bald person. There's nothing disrespectful about calling somebody a bald person. But can you imagine calling somebody a bald? Well, you know, when the balds say this and say that. We also don't use transgender as a verb. Now, sometimes you can use it creatively in language. We do things like that from time to time. But you and I have had conversations where you've said at times, even since we started this podcast, well, before you transgendered,
Yes.
and then I've had to say, well, that's not really a verb. That one's not so disrespectful as it is. It just doesn't really make sense. I didn't really transgender. I transitioned would be the word.
That's right. And those are little words like that are things that kind of let people know that you're not really quite connected yet.
There are other words that if somebody uses them to describe themselves are okay, but you would never want to assume that it's okay to use it for somebody else. For instance, an outdated term by and large would be transsexual. But there are some people that will self-identify as transsexual, and once they do, then that's okay to call them that. In the lesbian community, one of the words that has been reclaimed by many people in the community is the word dyke. But that's not a word that you would ever want to use. Even if somebody calls themselves that, it's not really a word that an outsider can use.
Well, you've just educated me. I just thought that was not an acceptable word at all for anyone.
There will, for instance, be some lesbian gatherings that might be called like a gathering at the bar I've seen called the dyke dive. And it's a way that the community has reclaimed a word that when you know everybody is safe and they're part of the community, you can use the word that outsiders use to make fun of you, and you all can kind of gather around that word and say, we've all been made fun of by society together. So we can reclaim that word and feel like in this community where it's all safe, we're going to use that word and it brings us together.
Sure, I can understand that.
When we're talking about couples, we generally want to talk about gay couples, or you can talk about gay and lesbian couples. Again, we don't talk about homosexual couples. And by and large, we've moved on from the language of same-sex couples. When you usually hear people talk about same-sex, it's oftentimes words that people will use in language from non-allies that are trying to find language that's a little more acceptable. They might talk about somebody struggling with same-sex attraction. And really, that's their way of saying, I don't agree with people that are acting on gay impulses, and I want to find language that is going to allow me to disagree, but without being too objectionable. And so when you're trying to be an ally, when you're talking about same-sex attraction, by and large, that's language that's been co-opted by homophobes. Now, there's one that's interesting that we can talk about. Homophobes is still the word that we use. We don't talk about gay phobes or lesbian phobes. We call it homophobia and transphobia. But we don't talk by and large about homosexuality or same-sex couples.
Well, you brought up an interesting subject here. So are there offensive words that the LGBTQ community uses for the people who are homophobes?
There probably are some, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. Homophobe would be the one that we normally talk about, or transphobe.
I can't think of any either.
Beyond that, probably bigot. And actually, that is one that it's not one that we would talk about publicly, but behind closed doors, when we're angry about the way somebody has treated us, that might be the way that we might talk. We'll come back to that point in a little bit.
It reminds me, I was just thinking about a word that was considered very negative about Americans. And I can remember reading about this quite a few years ago. And that word was Yankee. If you were called Yankee by the Brits, they didn't probably like to be called Brits because we called them Brits and they called us Yankee. And it was considered very negative. And by the way, the song Yankee Doodle, that was a very negative song.
I didn't know that.
Yes, it was it was making fun of Americans. And they don't even know what they're doing. Riding on a donkey, put a feather in his cap and called it macaroni. It was a very negative song. But what happened, the Americans adopted that word, Yankee, and it became something to be proud of.
That is what happens frequently in communities, is you will reclaim the word and the word takes on a different meaning and a different significance.
Mm-hmm.
And that happens all through time. In fact, what we're saying here right now could very easily be out of date in even a year or two because language is constantly changing. I think it's very likely if we were to come back and play this in 10 years, some of what I'm saying here will be quite outdated. The last one I want to talk about is oftentimes you will hear somebody being called a gay activist or a transgender activist. And again, that is largely language that we don't use. It's usually used by an outsider who disagrees with what that person stands for. The language that we would prefer is an advocate for gay equality, or advocates for transgender equality.
So that would be a word that would be offensive to me as well as you, correct?
I don't know if offensive is even the right word. If someone were to call me an activist, it mostly means it's going beyond what I am. I have had somebody call me an activist in the past that didn't understand what I had talked about or what my views were. And I thought, well, the main thing is it just is an overstatement. It makes me sound like such a radical, and
Yes.
I have never been a radical when it comes to these issues. In fact, if anything, when people have criticized me, it's because I'm too open to listen to the people that are coming around and learning about these issues. But we need people that are open to listening and talking, which is exactly why we're having this podcast.
That's right. That's how it is. And that's probably how it's going to be forever. As you said, language is always changing continually. And the kids today have slang that I don't know. And of course, as a boomer, I've got slang that would immediately mark me as a boomer if I used it. But we develop language slang in each one of our small little groups. In the subsets you talked about, within our families, we have our own little slang words that no one else uses. For example, I think you and I both know what a boodleata is.
Because that's a word you made up.
Yes, it's a made-up word, and it means a little kid. A little kid is a boodleata.
We grew up with you talking about some of the neighbor kids around, and you would say, oh, that boodleata over there. And it was always a young child that didn't really know what was going on and needed a parent's supervision.
That's right. So there are language things like this that are continually being introduced, and there are language things that are continually being overused and left behind.
Next, we want to talk about different patterns of language. This is not so much the words that we use as it is how do we talk about events in general? How do we respond? And primarily when we're talking about transphobes and homophobes, what is the best avenue for us to respond to that language without giving it a place, but also without making things worse? We talked about a month ago or a few months ago about, are we making things worse?
Yes. Well, I'd say, first of all, you don't want to use any language that is negatively charged. Some toxic language, for example. That toxic language is really to be avoided. By toxic, I mean something that is immediately going to create somebody, what did I say earlier, that brings their fur up like a cat.
Oftentimes for people that are critical, they will come up with their own words in their own language for how they want to describe themselves because they want to position it as a reasonable way to look at it. And we might be tempted to come back and say, well, you are just a bigot. You are just prejudiced. You do just hate us. And that's very much how many of us in the community feel, as we talked about earlier in this episode, that behind closed doors, that may be how we're talking about outsiders because we can feel a lot of pain. But when we're responding to the wider culture and when we're responding to those people in particular, we want to try, and especially as allies, we need allies to reduce the conflict, to bring down the tension level. And we do that by when those people are saying things that you would instead find more neutral ways to describe people. And the way that we have talked about it here is non-allies. I would hope that non-allies feel comfortable listening to our podcast. We strive to, and I don't know if we're always successful, but we strive to be a podcast where everybody can come and we can have a dialogue all together. We don't want to ever make you feel like if you think a certain way that you are not welcome here. But we do hope that as we talk about issues, that you will understand the LGBTQ community a little better, and that you may take a step from being a non-ally to being non-judgmental to moving to being accepting and then move to be affirming.
I remember saying before in one of our earlier podcasts, somebody might say, well, they are accepting but not affirming. And I know people who've said, well, that's just not acceptable. I think it is. It's acceptable because they're being honest, and it's a step in the right direction. They're moving in that direction. I personally have learned a lot since we started this podcast. I'm continually learning all the time. So I'm certainly affirming, but I've still got a long way to go because I don't understand everything. I don't understand even all of the terminology I should use and the terminology I shouldn't use. I'm learning every day.
And as you know, and all of us know, that brings us to the next point, that we want to be charitable in the way that we approach other people, so that if you get the wrong word, it's not a big deal. This is where the language is right now. If you're coming with a good heart, it's not going to be that big of a deal. Just like the person at the aviation booth.
Yes.
If he made it clear, I'm just getting into aviation here, and really what I do is I'm the graphic design person, and I'm just starting to learn about aviation. If he approached that person with a place of humility and said, but I can tell you what I do know is I know publishing really well, and I've got a great option for you, an opportunity for you to subscribe to our magazine, then that person would say, oh, I'm open to hear what you have to say.
Yes,
but if
that's
that
right.
person tried to set them up and say, I know everything there is to know about aviation, the other person would say, I don't think you do. And we continue walking along by.
And I have come across people like that often. You walk into a store and somebody's going to come over and try to sell you a mattress. They're going to tell me all about it. And a lot of times I've done some research because I know what kind of a mattress I'm looking for. And I discovered some of the things about it. And that's somebody who just started. They don't know a whole lot about it. If they try to snow me, they lose credibility. On the other hand, if they say, gee, I'm really new here and I don't know a whole lot about this, but I'll help you any way I can, great. And those of us who are salespeople, we want salespeople to succeed. So we are the easiest marks. We can be sold very easily.
I had that happen myself when I had a person come into my house and tried to sell me a bathroom.
Yes.
And I was all excited and ready to sign on the dotted line and sign away my life.
Yes.
And I called you first and you said, what are you thinking? Don't do that. But if you had been there, I think you would have been sold as well. I needed to have you there as the person to pull me back and say, don't spend too much money on this because a good salesperson is going to try to sell you.
Uh-huh.
On the other side, we also don't want to inadvertently validate the message from transphobes or from homophobes. We don't want to repeat the kinds of things that they're saying and give it a place or give it a platform. So, for instance, if people are talking about how gay and lesbian people are destroying the culture and this is terrible, everything that's happening with marriage, we want to respond from a place of positivity and say, look, we're all the same and we just want to live lives the same as everyone else. We just want equality, and everyone just wants to live lives where you can love who you love. What we don't want to do is say, these people out here are saying how much we're destroying marriage. It's like when you talk about don't think about.
Yes.
Think about.
Don't think about a pink elephant.
Right. And what do you think about immediately?
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to use the negative language. We instead want to use positive language.
Now, there are people in the LGBTQ community who are not like that. There are people in every community who kind of give that community a bad reputation. We know that, and those are the people we want to reach. We want everyone to send a positive message. It's not easy to do. I understand that. And we'll never be able to convert everyone. That just isn't going to happen. But the more we talk about it, the more we share with each other, the more examples we can give, the more likely we are to make additional headway. And it's happening. It's certainly happening. And we've got something coming in the future that's going to show examples of great things that are happening within the LGBT community and within the government and those kinds of things too. But that's for another time.
You're an ally and you're addressing issues of homophobia and transphobia. Steer away from words that describe this as conflict or war or a battle. We are not in a battle. We are not in a war. And for someone like me, I don't want to be the center of a conflict. Instead, use language like, we believe in justice for people that are suffering injustice. We believe in equality for everyone. We believe that everyone deserves equal rights. Those are the kinds of things that reduce the tension and help people realize that we're just like everyone else.
We want to make sure that everyone gets equal recognition and equal rights. It should not be an issue when it has nothing to do with you being LGBTQ or you being associated with LGBTQ. And that's for the baldies to concern themselves with.
The final one I want to talk about, and I've been guilty of this one myself. Don't compare LGBTQ discrimination and marginalization to racial marginalization. They're completely different things, and we can really find ourselves getting into hot water if we try to compare the two. Now, for me, I lived a big part of my life in society presenting as a straight cisgender man. So when I transitioned, all of a sudden, I discovered what it's like to be part of our marginalized community in a way that I had never realized before. And that helped me then to see how racial minorities can also be marginalized in other aspects where other people are marginalized as well. But we need to be very, very careful when we start trying to compare my experience as a white transgender woman to somebody else's experience as a black person trying to live in society, or as a Hispanic person, or as a person of color. They're entirely different circumstances. They're entirely different. When I try too hard to compare my experience, I can end up marginalizing the other person in ways that I didn't even realize. As a white person, I view the world through a society that everywhere I go, I live in a white culture. I don't know what it's like to be marginalized due to race. But I do know what it's like to be marginalized due to being transgender. And they're very different.
Oh, they certainly are. And I think that is a good lesson for us all to remember. And you have a good opportunity to remember that next Monday, there's going to be another awesome podcast right here. So you'll come back and we'll be happy to welcome you with open arms.
We'll see you Monday.